Hey Slavic Vikings, and did you know that the Vikings were once united? Well, not the actual Vikings, but the countries that consisted of the Viking people a couple of centuries later. And I do believe that there is some religious symbolism in what I just said, since one of the main reasons for the collapse into obscurity for the Vikings was the introduction and popularization of Christianity, and to be more precise, Catholicism in Northern Europe. So I believe that the Kalmar Union is somewhat of a new identity for the countries in the Nordics with the collapse of the pagan religions in the Nordics, and instead this new Christian, more moral foundation for a country was the Kalmar Union. I'm getting ahead of myself, so let me first say that the reason for making this video is because I promised to make a video on the Kalmar Union if my video on the unexpected Polish-Swedish Union got over 400 likes, and as you guessed, it got over 400 likes, not a lot, just 481, but that's enough for me to commit to make this video. And another thing, that video, the Polish-Swedish Union, is a perfect continuation of this video because it comes in the years after the collapse of the Kalmar Union. Sorry, a bit of a spoiler alert. Two more things, real quick. So I would really like to thank my only member on this channel, Naberon. I really appreciate the $2 a month you're giving me, so please don't unsubscribe. And I've officially launched the Polish-Dane Discord channel, Discord server, sorry, where there's a bunch of features. One of the cooler ones is video suggestions, so if you have any ideas on videos I should make, you can just go there. You'll also have like video notifications, you'll have custom emojis from the Poland Ball, Country Ball countries, which I've used a lot on my channel. There's a Polish, English, and Danish chats, a bunch of games you can do. It's just a fun server to chill. So click the link in the description to join that server. And the people who basically made the channel are Ropon, Sosie Klops, and Eric. I couldn't have made this server without them. I'm kind of a boomer when it comes to Discord servers, and they basically set up almost everything on the server, the bots and everything, so I really appreciate the help they did. And I would like to just quickly remind you that the subscribe button exists, and let's get on with the video. So first, what was the context of this union? What caused it to actually happen? So first, the geopolitical reason. So the Hanseatic League, which was basically a league of German traders around the Baltic, and the Teutonic Knights, which was a Christian group of knights, yes, which often fought against Poland, and in Poland they're known as Krzyżacy, the cross people or whatever. That's what kind of united us with the Scandinavians. We both really hated the Teutonic orders, but nevertheless, the expansion of these Teutonic Knights and Hanseatic League was a big cause of fear in the Scandinavian countries because they felt threatened over their control over the Baltic Sea. And this was a big motivation for the unification of Scandinavia, since that was the only way for them to counterbalance the power act of the expansion of these knights and Hanseatic people. When watching other history videos on YouTube, they often like going in depth into the lives of specific people and their relation to other royals, their lineage and family conflicts, etc. To me that's kind of boring, so I'll try to focus a bit more on the bigger picture. However, I do have to mention Queen Margaret's the first role, because she was inextricably, how the fuck do you say that? She was inextricably connected to the formation of the Kalmar Union, since during her reign from 1388 to 1397, she was one of the only female queens. She was even called the Woman King or something like that. And she adopted this nameless random guy and named him Eric of Pomerania, or in Polish, Eric Pomorski. And it's very important that I'm mentioning how to pronounce his name in Polish. It is because he was born in Darłowo Castle in modern day Poland. And actually, his name or his epithet, which means when you're a royal and leader, especially back in those days, you get like Eric the Great, Donald the Strong, or whatever, you know what I mean. And his epithet was a pejorative, which meant to indicate that he was not of Scandinavian descent. He was some German, Polish-ass Pomeranian dude. So they called him Eric of Pomerania, basically to make fun of him being the leader of Scandinavia without being truly Scandinavian. Interestingly enough, Eric was not even his real name, because his real name sounded too Polish. His real name was Bogislav, so he got his name changed to Eric, and he still got made fun of from being Polish or German. Those lands were not Polish then, let me remind you. Although I don't think that matters so much, because first of all, he co-ruled with the Queen Margaret, and when Queen Margaret died, some complicated royal mixing of families caused that he became the first leader of the Kalmar Union. The treaty which officially formalized this union was signed in the city, or specifically castle, of Kalmar in southern Sweden, which is still a bustling and hustling city nowadays. But I would like you to turn your attention to the exact borders, or exact known borders, you know, as close as we could get it from, since it was such a long time ago. But please take a look at this map and compare it to the modern maps of Scandinavia and the Nordics. Look how the north of Sweden and Norway and a lot of Finland is missing, and that is because the Kalmar Union consisted of the white majority populations, at least mostly, and it did not contain the Sami people. The Sami people are people who have lived there for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, and they have a very unique culture and identity, and only through years of suppression of the Sami people, they have assimilated or disappeared totally from the culture, which is why nowadays they are part of those Scandinavian countries. Don't worry, Denmark also did some bad stuff. They just don't have those people in their mainland, but they couldn't resist for some suppression, so they just flew over to Greenland and did some suppression and genital cutting over there. Coming back to this union, it's worth to remember that it was very unstable, especially in the early years, and especially during the years of our Polish Eric, because in 1430 the Engelbrekt rebellion caused our guy Eric to get kicked out of power just 6 years later, and funnily enough, with him being fired from his job, he turned to piracy, and he just accepted his new life of sailing around the Baltic and stealing other boats. From being the king of one of the most powerful unions in Europe, he turned to piracy in the poor old Baltic Sea. It is true that the cultures and languages of the Scandinavian nations was and is very similar. However, it is very important to remember that both then and now, the cultures, traditions and languages and nationalities of the Scandinavian countries are still very different, and that's why in the Kalmar Union this had to be accounted for, and that's why each kingdom retained a lot of legal and administrative identity and power. And the lack of a centralized government actually often led to disputes and inefficiencies, which contributed to the instability of this union. But what was the capital of this union? So you might expect it to be Kalmar because, you know, the entire union is named after Kalmar and that's where it got founded. But no, that place is too small. Well, then Copenhagen. Okay, so Copenhagen was kind of the de facto capital, but actually there was no one real capital, and I believe this was so no country would get favoritism. Although in practice, de facto, Denmark did get a lot of favoritism in the union because most of the leadership and government was stabilized and centralized in Denmark. And for that reason, the de facto capital was in Copenhagen, but that caused a lot of conflict in the future. Another thing that culturally and politically connects Poland with the Scandinavian countries and the Kalmar Union is its deep tradition in elective monarchies. So both of these countries, okay, let's forget Poland, focus on the Kalmar Union for now. So the Kalmar Union has a long history of having elective monarchies, where the nobility of each countries gets to pick the ruling king, which worked pretty well, although it allows it to be very vulnerable to corruption. But that wasn't as big of an issue as in Poland. A bigger issue in the Kalmar Union was the constant political and ideological struggle between the monarchies of the individual nations and the overall aristocracy, which benefited from the union. And the conflict between the monarchy and aristocracy was a huge issue which caused the most instability. There was never a clear answer of how much unification of the individual member states was enough or too much. Does this remind you of anything nowadays? Let me know in the comments below. Do you remember the main motivation for this union? That's right, it was the expansion of the Hanseatic League. And this unification and the years after the unification proved that this unification proved successful. Since because of this unification, the Hanseatic League lost a lot of its powers, and actually there came a lot of more benefits from this union. For example, it streamlined the trade policies and custom duties across Denmark, Norway and Sweden, which enhanced its economic cohesion a lot. For example, because of this free trade and each of the member countries having very different products, you could use the iron from Sweden and then use the wheat and food from Denmark and the fish from Norway, and each of those would allow for one very diverse and free market. Does this remind you of anything? It is very important to not forget the Catholic Church influence in this nation, since it existed through the peak of the Middle Ages, which meant the peak of the Catholic Church. And I do not think that it is a coincidence that the Kalmar Union collapsed during the start of the Renaissance, or in other words, the start of the Reformation, which was when Martin Luther put all of those new rules, those things he disagreed with on the Catholic Church, and basically started the Protestant movement, which later defined Scandinavian culture, since nowadays all of Scandinavia is fiercely Protestant, but then it was fiercely Catholic, and I believe that somehow this new Protestant revelation during the Renaissance indirectly caused the Kalmar Union to collapse. But how did this union end specifically? So I go much more into depth into this in my video on the Polish-Swedish Union, which you see in the corner now, so I recommend you watch that if you want beautiful context and what happens after the dissolution of the Kalmar Union in that video. And I have to correct a mistake I made in that video, since I talked about the Stockholm bloodbath, and that's a very important event which led to the dissolution of the Kalmar Union. However, I would like to clarify that in the Stockholm bloodbath, the bloodbath was about anti-unionists being murdered by pro-unionists, mostly Danish people murdering Swedish people, because, you know, Denmark benefited the most from this union, but Denmark got its ass kicked and it lost its union, since only 3 years after Gustav Vasa rebelled and Sweden became independent. And it turned out to be a good idea that they got independent, because Denmark only a couple of decades afterwards got to build one of the most powerful military empires in Europe, with almost full control over the Baltic Sea. And Denmark got very bitter, since Denmark and Sweden statistically are the two countries with the most wars between them in all of history. They have hundreds and hundreds of wars between them throughout all of history, and it is kind of surprising to learn that, since if you know how close those two countries are nowadays, culturally and politically. But anyway, coming back to Kalmar and the dissolution of Kalmar. After the dissolution, Sweden and Denmark had a bunch of wars, mostly because of Norway, because when Sweden got out of the Kalmar Union, Denmark still held on to Norway. But then in 1814, Norway also got its independence from Denmark. So Denmark was this small ball with some colonies up north. And then Sweden took Norway again, which kind of created satisfying borders. They had this like penis peninsula. But then Norway got its independence, and only a couple years afterwards, they found oil and became one of the richest countries on earth. Is that a coincidence? Let me know in the comments below. And that's it for this video. Please go to the Discord server and thank Ropon, Sosje Klops and Eric for helping me create this Discord server. Please check it out, link in description. Check out the history playlist if you want more videos on history by me. Consider subscribing, consider becoming a member, and as always, farvel, żegnam and goodbye.